A husband blackmailing his own wife on Perry Mason? Say it ain't so. It's Season 1, Episode 23 of Perry Mason, The Case of the One-Eyed Witness. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give you a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. A local restaurant is a key setting for today's episode, and it reminded me that in our last episode, The Case of the Fugitive Nurse, there was an awful lot of food talk. First, there was Kirby's Drive-In.
Oh, Frederick. Are you putting 3 whole pickles on every hamburger plate?
Yes, Mrs. Kirby.
Why?
Well, to garnish the coleslaw.
Then there was Perry's Diet.
Would you care for something? Our hamburgers are quite good. They're only 35 cents, and that includes French fries.
No, thank you. I'm on a diet.
Then we encountered the delicate constitution of Gladys Strome's brother.
Arthur, have some more meat.
Any more potatoes?
Sure.
And finally, in the denouement, Della talked about her own dietary restrictions.
In case you haven't noticed, I've been losing weight, Mr. Mason. In fact, I dropped about 3 pounds after every one of your cases.
From working too hard?
No, from coming back here and going without dinner. So this time I brought my own. Cold cuts, anyone?
Food is often a big deal in the Perry Mason novels. Within the first 2 pages of The Case of the Moth-Eaten Mink, Perry and Della are ordering 2 thick steaks, medium rare, lots of lyonnaise potatoes, and some buttered bread with garlic. In the novel for The Case of the One-Eyed Witness, we see Paul hand Perry a mug full of his patented get-you-warm, hot buttered rum, with Paul's expert recipe of some hot water, spices, a cube of butter, a little sugar, and a big slug of rum. A quick hypothesis: we see the camaraderie of Della, Paul, and Perry best when we see them around food. And typically, their journeys into the land of food are typically light-hearted ones, at least in terms of the tone of the episode, in opposition to the serious murders Paul, Perry, and Della have to deal with. We'll see how this hypothesis plays out over the course of the series. Without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The Case of the One-Eyed Witness. Marion Fargo is in trouble. She's young, good-looking, and hanging out in sketchy bus stations. Her personal tormentor is a short, balding man with an air of sophistication, one Samuel Carlin. He has incriminating evidence about Marion's brother Charles Gallagher and has bilked Marion out of a small fortune thus far.
Haven't you been blackmailing me long enough?
Mrs. Fargo, please.
$1,000 every month for the past year.
Actually, it's only been 10 months. Believe me, Mrs. Fargo, I can sympathize with you completely. Tell tell me, how would you like it if you were never to see me again? Well, I can see the prospect is attractive. For a lump sum payment, I could oblige you.
How much?
Oh, shall we say, $10,000?
Carlin isn't alone on the act, however. His inside man is Marion's own husband, the oily Arthur.
You plan to nick my way for another 10,000 and then skip out.
Would I do a thing like that?
You would, and you have. Marion told me that she's been paying you $1,000 a month.
But that's not true. I only asked for 500 as you and I agreed, on my word of honor.
Oh, shut up. The way I figure it, you've double-crossed me out of $5,000 already.
When the front room of Carlin's joint blows up and Arthur himself winds up dead, the police suspect Marion. Of course, Perry's gotten involved. Clients rarely turn to him after the crime has been committed. Instead, they enlist his services as a prelude to murder. Here, Marion solicits Perry's services while he and Della dine at a quaint French restaurant.
One moment, please. Good evening. Do you have a reservation?
Yes, it's under the name of Perry Mason.
Ah, Mr. Mason. One moment, please. This way, please. Phone call for you, Mr. Mason.
Did anyone know we were here?
I didn't even know myself until I called for the reservations.
If you would rather not be annoyed.
No, I'll talk to him.
It is not a him.
In a few minutes, you'll receive an envelope and a retainer. Please deliver this envelope to Mr. Carlin, but only after he gives you a file.
What kind of file?
It concerns a man named Charles Gallagher.
In a typical episode, Perry will reluctantly accept clients if Della sees them first and gives her okay. By contrast, it's Perry's brief conversation with Marion, free from any secretarial mediation, that convinces him to take the case. Once he gets his hands on a retainer, Perry gets to work. The key legal twist in this episode features the titular witness. The police's case rests on Marion's bus trip away from LA following the crime, and only one witness can put Marion on that bus for the entire LA trip, Diana Maynard.
Miss Maynard, would you be willing to dictate a statement to the effect that Mrs. Fargo was on that bus ever since it left Los Angeles?
Of course, but I'm afraid I don't understand.
Ever hear of a lawyer named Perry Mason?
Well, isn't he the one who's always mixed up in some kind of a murder case?
Exactly what this is. Come on, let's go find us a public stenographer.
The problem is that Maynard has an eye infection and a weak constitution. When she gets a third degree from Berger and Tragg, she changes her story, capitulates, and agrees to become a witness for the prosecution.
I've got half a dozen witnesses that say she got on at Wayne City at 11:30.
They're wrong.
Everybody's wrong but you, is that it? Was the bus crowded when you got on?
Very.
And how soon did you notice Mrs. Fargo?
Right after the bus started. I read for a little while, and then when I finished my magazine, I saw her.
Well, that might have been a half hour after the bus started, mightn't it?
Well, yes.
Or even an hour.
I don't think so.
When you noticed Mrs. Fargo, where was she sitting?
In the middle of the bus.
On which side?
The right as you face the driver.
Suppose we told you that Mrs. Fargo claims she was sitting right behind the driver.
I would have sworn that she...
And you would have been guilty of perjury.
Just a side question, why can't Berger and Tragg affect this kind of interrogative energy in the courtroom? When Perry gets Diana Maynard on the stand, he proceeds to rip her to shreds, using her own testimony to out the real murderer. Carlin!
What's going on here? Who is that man?
The genius who dreamed up this stunt, Mr. Samuel D. Carlin.
The suspected deceased. The episode does have a happy ending. Charles Gallagher, the fugitive brother, gets a reprieve from the governor, who was looking for him after he escaped from a boys' prison.
And His Excellency the Governor wishes me to inform you that our estate has no desire to extradite Charles Gallagher. We feel that Mr. Gallagher has proved he can be a good and useful citizen. Kindest personal regards, George Mayberry, Chairman, State Penal System.
But who knows what will become of poor Marion? It's never clear whether or not she knew the connection between her husband and Carlin. And will she idealize her husband in the aftermath of his death, or will she forever be left with the scars of his betrayal? In Perry's world, odds are on the latter. Now, let's compare the television plot with the 1950 novel. Once again, there are some pretty significant differences between the book and television adaptation. The One-Eyed Witness. Yes, she's in the book. Yes, she's Diana Maynard, but she was never in the bag for Perry in the novel. She was always a prosecution witness, intended to get on the bus to confuse witnesses by dressing like Mrs. Fargo. Perry pulls the same "can you identify this man" stunt in the book as he does in the show. Carlin, now in the book, he's super creepy and the mastermind of a adoption blackmailing ring. Yep, it's really elaborate, but it involves the restaurant and Carlin and Pierre, and you get the idea. The husband, yep, Mr. Margot is in on the adoption blackmailing ring, and he's fooling around with a woman we see who plays a role in capturing Carlin. The defendant, well, Mrs. Margot isn't trying to protect her brother, because the brother doesn't exist in the novel. It's her middle school-aged son she really cares about. And unlike the Marion in the TV episode, she knows her husband is a schnook before the husband winds up dead. And then there's Perry. How is he different in the book? Well, he's dining at the Golden Goose, a floor show joint in LA, rather than Little Cafe with expensive coffee. We actually see Perry use his fists rather than just his brains in this particular book when he knocks Carlin out during a confrontation late in the book. To sum up, the Charles Gallagher material, totally new for the episode, and apparently there was at least one draft of the television script that tried to retain the adoption ring storyline, but Earl Stanley Gardner apparently nixed it because it hinged on a point that ESG thought was passé. Note, the adoption ring plot will come up in a later episode this season, the case of the screaming woman. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul this week concerns the price of coffee. Perry and Della are sitting in a cafe looking at prices, and it's the coffee that catches their eye.
Coffee $1. Coffee $1. Coffee $1.
It should have. That's $8.86 for a cup of Joe in 2019 cash. Hokey smokes, Perry. So here's your research prompt. What's the swankiest restaurant in LA you can find that lists its menu prices and gives you the cost of a cup of coffee? Is it higher than $8? Our Della this week concerns Angie Dickinson, the actress who portrayed defendant Marion Fargo.
Then you know about Charles.
Yes, he came to my office.
Well, then you can understand why I don't want to involve him. If he ever goes back to that prison farm, they'll kill him.
Hailing from the bustling metropolis of Culm, North Dakota, population 354 as of the 2010 census, Dickinson starred in over 50 films in her illustrious career, including roles alongside John Wayne in Rio Bravo, Frank Sinatra in Ocean's 11, and Lee Marvin in Point Blank. Perhaps most famously, she was the policewoman in the 1970s, a role which earned her 3 Emmy Awards. Her second husband, Toonsmith Burt Bacharach, though they divorced in 1981. She's still alive and kicking at the tender age of 87. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's trump card over Paul. Now, we've seen Perry support Paul on the dating market by giving him some cash at the end of the case of the Crooked Candle, but in this episode, where we actually see Paul on a date, we see Perry stepping in before Paul can hit the nightclubs.
Della, wait a minute. Have a heart, will you? I got a date. She expects to go to a few nightclubs.
And Perry expects you to be at 6920 West Lorendo. Now, just who's going to be stood up?
Better remember whose cash is footing the bill for your after-hours fun, Paul. Perry, that's who. Our theme for this episode is compliance. This is certainly never a problem with Perry's clients. Marion Fargo ranks as one of his most uncompliant clients, and it's only Della's ingenuity with Charles.
Suppose I kick it around with Mason.
You can't. He's an officer of the court. He'd have to turn you in.
Well, then the best thing for me to do for the time being is get lost, don't you think?
I'm not permitted to advise you, Mr. Gallagher.
Can I get out that way? Thank you.
That allows Perry to figure out why Marion simply won't help him. What's fascinating is that this episode reveals Perry using one of his most enduring courtroom techniques, preying upon a criminal's overcompliance. He's tricked more than a few witnesses into giving away too much on the stand in their eagerness to seem cooperative. Here, he has Della move around the room and point to particular witnesses in the courtroom to test Diana Maynard's eyesight. When she correctly identifies a man she should not have known, she exposes herself.
Then who is that man?
I don't know his name, but he's the parking attendant at the airport.
You're sure about that?
Positive.
You recognize him as the man you saw at the airport parking lot?
No, I recognize him as a witness.
How could you do that? This is the first session of court you've attended.
Well, I saw his picture in the papers.
You couldn't have. Miss Kelly made sure you saw nothing that concerned this trial.
Well, I talked to Mr. Berger after I got back.
How did you know he was the parking lot attendant unless you parked Mrs. Fargo's car at the airport yourself?
In short order, we find out that Carlin is still alive, and Maynard derisively laughs at Carlin from the witness stand.
Look at him. He was going to get away with murder.
Well, it's not clear to me. Is Diana laughing because Carlin should have been 1,000 miles from the court? I guess that's sort of funny, but the real joke is on Maynard. She just admitted to being an accomplice to murder because she insisted on complying with Perry's wishes. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. We joke about Perry and money, but we know he treats his friends right when they go out to eat.
You know, this restaurant's going to need a lawyer one of these days.
Why?
Grand larceny. Look at these prices.
My dear Miss Street, you know enough not to read on the right-hand side of the menu.
Now, if you think the coffee prices scared Della and Perry away, just note the episode's ending.
Am I presentable enough to take you to dinner?
Definitely.
Where do you want to go?
Farrell's Cafe.
Why there?
Well, there's something that still puzzles me in this case.
Mm-hmm.
What could they possibly put in a cup of coffee to make it worth $1?
When you get a client who can pay, or who has a brother like Charles Gallagher who can pay, you celebrate by dining in style. Hey, don't look at the right-hand column. Now let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks so much to those of you who gave me feedback on the case of the fugitive nurse. My Aunt Myra dug the breakdown of the episode titles. My mom commented that the case of the fugitive nurse was unique in that the murder victim, Dave Kirby, was more likable than any of the episode's other characters, Mrs. Morris, Doc Morris, or Gladys, or the miserly Mrs. Kirby for sure. My dad let it be known that Mr. Reese, the photographic memory-owning airplane mechanic, should probably get hooked up with the elevator operator from the upcoming case of the daring decoy. And his other comment, a really fascinating one, is that he liked the fact that Doc Morris, despite his belief in a kill or be kill world, was not committed to the randomness of the universe.
Still, the course of nature says that nothing can be really aimless. So they must take a direction and destroy or be destroyed.
My dad adds that this worldview is one that resonates with reality and comports with the worldview of the Bible. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on, or something that you would like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com, or you can email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. Just a small note, all my pod episodes are now available via Spotify and YouTube if you want to check them out there. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time, we've got our first non-novel adapted episode of the series. Get ready for things to get schizophrenic. It's the case of the Deadly Double. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!